Let's read a story, shall we? The Man in the Bearskin. There once was a young fellow who enlisted as a soldier. He was brave and courageous, and always foremost in the thick of the battle. As long as there was a war that continued, he got on very well. But when peace was proclaimed, he received his discharge, and the captain told him he might go as soon as he pleased. He had, however, no home to go to, for his parents were dead, and at last he thought he might try his brothers, and ask them to give him a home until a war broke out again. But his brothers, they were hard-hearted, and said, "What could we do with you here? You are not fit to help us, so you had better try to go and provide for yourself." The soldier had nothing of his own but his gun, so he placed it on his shoulder and went out into the world to seek for a living. So after walking for some distance, he came to a hearth on which only a few trees were growing, and they grew in a circle. So feeling very sorrowful, he sat down under these trees and began to reflect upon his fate. "I have no money," he said to himself. "I have never learned anything but soldiering, and now peace is proclaimed, I am not wanted. I can see that there is nothing before me but starvation." At that moment he heard a rustling sound, and looking round he saw a strange man standing before him. He wore a green coat and looked rather stately, but he had a very ugly cloven foot. "I know very well what you want," said he to the soldier, "and money and possessions you shall have, as much as you can spend, however extravagant you may be. But I must discover first whether you are a coward, and that my money may not be thrown away." "A soldier and afraid? Who can put those two words together?" he replied. "Try me if you like." "Willingly," answered the man. "Now look behind you." The soldier turned and saw an immense bear who was growling and trotting towards him. "Oh!" cried the soldier, "I will tickle your nose for you presently, my friend, and stop your growling," he said, raising his gun, and he shot the bear in the head so surely that he fell in a heap on the ground and moved no more. "I see clearly," said the stranger, "that you are not wanting in courage, but there is one more condition you must agree to." "Well, if it does not harm me in the future," replied the soldier, who knew well who he was talking to, "I don't care what I promise to do." "You can tell for yourself whether the conditions are likely to injure you in the future," was the reply, "and they are these. You must neither wash yourself, nor comb your hair, nor cut your nails or beard, nor say your prayers for the next 7 years, and I will give you this coat and cloak, which you must wear the whole time. Should you die during these 7 years, you are mine, but if you live beyond that time, you will be rich and independent for the rest of your life." The soldier sat for some minutes thinking of the great poverty in which he then was, and how often he had faced death without fear, and at last decided to accept the stranger's conditions. The wicked old demon immediately took off his green coat and offered it to the soldier and said, "Whenever you have that cloak on, you will find plenty of money in the pocket if you put your hand in it." Then he pulled off the skin of the dead bear, and he gave it to him and said, "This is to be used by you as a cloak and a bed. You must not, for the whole 7 years, dare to sleep in any other bed, nor wear any other cloak, and on this account you shall be called Bearskin." Having said this, the stranger vanished. The soldier immediately put on the coat, and putting his hands in the pockets, he found that the money was a reality. Then he hung the bearskin on his shoulders and went out into the world, rejoicing in his good fortune, and buying all he wished with that money. For the first year, his unwashed face, his uncombed and uncut hair and beard did not disfigure him so very much. But during the second year, he began to look like a monster. The hair covered the whole of his face. His beard looked like a piece of coarse blanket. His fingers had claws instead of nails, and his face was so covered in dirt that if mustard and cress had been sown there, they would have grown. Those who saw him for the first time, they always ran away. But wherever he went, he gave money to the poor, and therefore they all prayed that he might live for the 7 years. As he paid well for night's lodging on all occasions, he always was sure to have shelter. In the 4th year, he came to an inn, but the landlord, on seeing him, would not take him in, nor even let him sleep in the stables. He thought such a monster would frighten the horses. However, when Bearskin put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a handful of gold pieces, the landlord began to soften, and gave him a room in one of the outbuildings. But he made him swear that he would not allow himself to be seen, for fear of getting the house into a bad reputation. In the evening, when Bearskin was sitting by himself and wishing that the 7 years were over, he heard in an adjoining room loud lamentations. The soldier had a pitying heart, so he opened the door and saw an old man clasped with his hands over his head, weeping bitterly. Bearskin advanced towards him, and the old man sprang up to run away, when, however, he heard a kind, human voice speaking to him in friendly tones, and he was inclined to remain. And the soldier's soothing words at last encouraged him to disclose the cause of his grief. His property, he said, had dwindled away by degrees, and now his daughters would starve. He had not, he said, even the money enough to pay the landlord, and he supposed he would be sent to prison. "If you have no other trouble," replied Bearskin, "I can help you. I have plenty of money." Then he sent for the landlord, paid the old man's bill, and gave him a purse full of gold to put in his pocket. When the old man found himself so quickly relieved from his present anxieties, he did not know how to sufficiently express his thanks. But at length he thought of his daughters. "Come home with me," he said. "I will introduce you to my 3 daughters. They are wonders of beauty, and you will have one of them, if you'd like, for a wife. When they hear of everything that you have done for me, they will not refuse you. You are certainly a strange-looking man, but that is easily got over." Bearskin was very pleased with this invitation, and went home with the old man quite readily. No sooner, however, did the eldest daughter catch sight of him than with a scream of terror she rushed away. The second stood still and looked at him from head to foot. "How could I accept such a man for a husband?" she said. "Why, he has not the slightest resemblance to a human being. The grizzly bear who came to see us once called himself a man. Pleased me much better. He did wear a cap and white gloves. If he were only ugly, I might get used to him, but not as he is." The youngest, however, spoke gently and said, "Dear father, he must be a good man, if he has helped you so generously out of your trouble. And if you have promised him a bride, you must keep your word." It was a pity that Bearskin's face was so covered with dirt and hair, or she would have seen how happy he was at these words. However, he took a ring from his finger, broke it in half, gave her one half, and kept the other for himself. On one half he wrote her name, and he kept the other half for himself. He gave it to her, and he begged her to take care of it, and said, "For 3 years longer I must travel about, but at the end of that time I will return. If I do not return, you will be free, for I will be dead. but pray to God every day that my life may be preserved." Then he said farewell and left her. After he was gone, the bride dressed herself in black, and when she thought of her bridegroom, the tears would come to her eyes. Her sisters thought it was a great amusement, and they did nothing but mock her and jeer her about her lover. "You must pay attention to the manner in which he takes your hand," said the eldest, "for his claws may be sharp." "And take care," said the other, "for that he does not eat you up if you please him, and bears are fond of sweet things." "Ah, yes," continued the eldest, "you must always do as he pleases, or he will growl at you." "Well," said the other sister, "at least we'll have a merry wedding at all events, for bears are noted for their dancing." The bride kept her silence, and her sisters soon found that they could not make her angry with anything they said to her. Meanwhile, Bearskin was traveling about from one place to the other, doing good on every opportunity, and relieving the poor and afflicted with the greatest sympathy, so that he had so many people to pray for him that he might live as long as he could. The last day of the 7th year dawned, and Bearskin went to the hearth and waited underneath the trees which grew in a circle. He did not wait long, for with a rush of wind came the demon who had appeared to him just 7 years before, looked at him with the most ill-tempered and disappointed face. He threw down the soldier's own coat, asked him for his green coat and the bearskin cloak. "Stop a bit," said the soldier. "You are going too fast. You must wash me first." So the demon was obliged, whether he liked it or not, to fetch water and wash and shave the soldier, and afterwards to comb his hair and cut his nails. When this was done, the brave soldier looked himself again, and indeed much handsomer than before. As soon as his unpleasant companion had happily left him, he rose with a light heart and went into town. He bought a magnificent velvet suit and seated himself in a carriage drawn by 4 splendid white horses, and drove to the house of his bride. No one recognized him. The merchant took him for a nobleman or a field officer, and led him into the room where his 3 daughters sat. He was obliged to yield to the request of the 2 eldest that he would sit between them during dinner. They helped him to wine, and they placed all the choicest dishes before him, while they thought they had never seen such a handsome man before. The bride, who sat opposite of him in her black dress, with downcast eyes, did not utter a word. At last, when they were alone, the father asked the soldier if he would like to marry either of his daughters. On hearing this, the 2 eldest ran to their rooms to change their dresses, and both arrayed themselves in the gayest attire they possessed, and each fancied that she would be the chosen one. Meanwhile, the soldier found himself alone with his bride, and taking out the half of the ring which he had kept in his pocket, he threw it into a glass of wine which stood on the table, and presented it to her. As she took it, she saw at the bottom of the glass the half of the ring. With a beating heart, she lifted the ribbon which hung around her neck, where the other half of the ring was at. She placed the 2 halves together and found that they exactly joined. Then the soldier, looking fondly at her, exclaimed, "I am your bridegroom, whom you once knew as Bearskin. Through the mercy of heaven I have recovered my natural shape, and am made free of the evil power which caused me to be so disfigured." Then he went to her, took her in his arms, and embraced her fondly. Just at this moment, the sisters entered the room in full dress, and when they discovered that this handsome young soldier belonged to their sister, and heard that he was the man that they had laughed at, who was once called Bearskin, they were so overcome with rage and vexation that one went and drowned herself in a well, and the other hung herself on a tree in the garden. In the evening there was a knock on the door, and when the bride-elect opened it and saw a strange man standing there in a green coat, And then he said to her, "See now, I have lost one, but I have gained two instead."